Hello, my name is Bob Van Meter, and I want to talk with you about the history of housing discrimination in the United States. I want to thank the Citizens Housing and Planning Association for working to make sure that even in the current national crisis, we continue to increase awareness of housing discrimination and fair housing. I'm working with the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action to create a curriculum on the history of housing discrimination and the impact of that discrimination, and I'm sharing with you some of the insights of that work. As a lifelong housing activist involved in the development of affordable housing, I was certainly aware of some of this history. But in 2017, I read a book that changed my perspective on housing discrimination and how important it was to understand it. That book was The Color of Law, The Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. The book's argument is that housing segregation is not simply the result of individual actions by people on where to live, or even simply of the broader inequality between racial and ethnic groups, though those things play a role. It is, in fact, the result of decades of action by all levels of government that limited housing opportunities for African Americans and other ethnic groups, and created the current segregated landscape of our region, of our state, and of our country. That is a divided and unequal landscape. Most people have heard the term redlining, the policy that limited the access of African Americans and others to mortgages. Redlining was not in the first instance the result of decisions by the banks, though the banks were not blameless. It was in fact government policy that the government would not insure mortgages in neighborhoods where African Americans lived, because it judged those neighborhoods to be high risk. The flip side of that was that they would not allow African Americans to move into the other neighborhoods. This policy started in the 1930s during the New Deal, but it continued long after, and its impacts are still with us. Bad as it was, redlining is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to government actions and policies that fostered housing segregation. These actions and policies include zoning laws that initially explicitly excluded African Americans from living in certain districts of cities and towns, and later, when that was found unconstitutional, instead zoned many parts of cities and towns to exclude multifamily housing because that was a type of housing more likely to be affordable to African Americans. Those exclusionary zoning practices continue to this day. It includes state and local courts that enforced racially restrictive covenants that barred homeowners from selling their property to a person of African American descent. Government also looked the other way when neighbors used violence to make African Americans unwelcome in their communities, in states from Illinois to Pennsylvania. And sometimes government punished the African American homebuyer instead of the perpetrator of the violence. It included another New Deal program, public housing, which created segregated housing developments that sometimes destroyed previously integrated neighborhoods. That segregation was official government policy for public housing from the 1930s to the 1950s. These policies and others have had a profound impact. Despite the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, the impact continues to this day. One of the most important consequences was that African Americans, including the million African American veterans who served in World War II, were excluded from the greatest wealth-building opportunity for American families of the 20th century. That is, when after World War II, millions of white veterans and other white families were able to buy low-cost homes with government-insured mortgages and to see those homes increase in value over the decades, helping to create the American middle class. A study in 2012 by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston documented the lasting impact of that lost opportunity. The average American household in Greater Boston had assets of less than $1,000, while white households averaged assets of $256,000. Housing segregation has had many other costs for African Americans. Those costs include higher levels of pollution in African American neighborhoods and lack of access to the most well-resourced schools. The good news is that the segregated society that we live in did not just happen. It was created by specific actions and policies, and we have the power to redress those actions and build a more equitable and less segregated society. I would encourage all of you to read The Color of Law to learn more about this history, an especially appropriate book for Fair Housing Month. And this is what the cover of the book looks like. So thank you.